Hello, everyone, and thank you all for joining us during the Lytham Partners Summer 2022 Investor Conference. My name is Roger Weiss, and I'm a Vice President here at Lytham Partners. In this presentation, we welcome Aytu BioPharma, NASDAQ ticker symbol AYTU, and with us today is their Chief Executive Officer, Josh Disbrow. Before we begin, I want to remind everyone that management is available for one-on-one meetings later this week. If you've not already signed up, please send me an email at weiss@lythampartners.com or visit our website, www.lythampartners.com/virtual, and click the one-on-one meetings request button. All right, Josh, let's begin. Could you start off by introducing yourself and giving a quick overview of the company?
Yeah, thanks, Roger. Yeah, my name is Josh Disbrow. As Roger mentioned, I'm the Chief Executive Officer and one of the co-founders of Aytu BioPharma. We were previously called Aytu Bioscience and changed our name to Aytu BioPharma upon the closing of our merger with Therapeutics back in March of 2021. My background is extensively throughout pharma and entrepreneurial ventures within pharma. As long as I can remember, I've been in the pharmaceutical business. My dad ran GlaxoSmithKline's North American technical operations. I started off my career as a summer intern at Glaxo and began as a sales representative in Western North Carolina, progressed through various roles. Ultimately, my brother started a company called Arbor Pharmaceuticals. I joined him as the first full-time employee when we were 31 years old. We're identical twins. We grew Arbor to in excess of 250 million in annualized revenue. We exited when our stake was purchased by a large private equity firm, having valued the company at over $1 billion. I subsequently moved to Denver, Colorado, and started Aytu BioPharma as a spin out of a company called Pharma, where I was Chief Operating Officer. The company is about 7 years old. We uplisted to NASDAQ from the Bulletin Board in 2017, and we've been growing tremendously ever since. The company's focused on prescription pharmaceuticals. We've largely built our portfolio through a series of strategic transactions, and we're about $100 million in revenue. We have a really nice pipeline that we're excited about that we can get to, and we continue to grow leaps and bounds. So excited to share the story with you.
Great. Josh, there have been a lot of changes with the company, especially over the last 2+ years. Could you give us a little overview of the evolution of the company and where you're positioned today?
Yeah. Excuse me. Yeah, happy to. Yes, it's been an exceedingly busy, very productive and exciting last couple of years with the company. If you fast forward to just prior to the pandemic, we were a company that had generated just over $7 million in annual revenues, had really a single product in the portfolio. And we made the decision really prior to the pandemic that we wanted to scale significantly. We wanted to expand the portfolio of prescription therapeutics and even actually get into consumer healthcare. So we made a bold move and made a series of acquisitions. Starting in November of 2019, we picked up a line of pediatric prescription products from a company that was then called Cerecor. They're now called Avalo. We followed that with the acquisition of a couple of COVID assets, inclusive of our asset Healite, which remains in clinical development. And then we went on to acquire a consumer health company called Novus Pharmaceuticals, raised some capital, really put the company in a solid position of strength, such that as the pandemic continued, we continued to grow, we continued to expand. We then acquired a pediatric ADHD company called Therapeutics, and we closed on that transaction back in March of 2021. And our acquisitions culminated with the acquisition of Rumpus Therapeutics just a month thereafter, April of 2021. And that brought in our rare disease asset that we call AR101. And this is for a rare disease called VEDS, and excited about that pipeline. So we have gone from a company that was generating just in excess of 7 million in revenue to now on track to do 100 million in annualized revenue, having just posted our highest quarter in company history with 24.2 million in revenue for the quarter ending March 31st. And we've got a great portfolio. We've got a focus on pediatrics and ADHD and a future focus on pediatric-onset rare diseases and an exciting pipeline that's now in tow. So it's been a very, very busy, productive, and exciting couple of years.
That's great. You just mentioned that you're going to do close to $100 million of revenue run rate. Could you describe specifically the products that are generating those revenues and how you think about marketing and growth?
Yeah, so the primary focus of the company is on prescription pharmaceuticals, and that represents about 2/3 of our revenue. The prescription portfolio is comprised primarily of the ADHD brands that we acquired out of Neos Therapeutics last year, as I mentioned. ADHD, first of all, is a huge category. It's one of the largest prescription categories in the country. It's a 75+ million annual prescription market, and we compete in the largest segment of the ADHD market, the stimulant market. So we have a product called Adzenys, which is an orally disintegrating tablet. It's an extended release formulation of amphetamine and is the only orally disintegrating tablet on the market. That competes with the likes of Adderall XR and so forth. And that's our largest product by revenue and by prescription volume. Our next product is a methylphenidate called Cotempla, which competes with Concerta and the likes of those products in the methylphenidate stimulant category. That's a slightly smaller product, but still a significant revenue driver for us. It too is an orally disintegrating tablet, and it's extended release and competes very favorably in the marketplace, given that it is the only ODT. It's got excellent clinical data showing 61% symptom improvement within a single hour of taking the dose. It lasts a full day, so it's great for kids in the classroom throughout the day as they get home, as they get through the homework hour. So that's rough of those two products alone represent roughly half of our close to 100 million in annualized revenue. We also have some smaller products that are general pediatric products. So we have a line of multivitamins that contain fluoride called Poly-Vi-Flor and Tri-Vi-Flor. These compete in a relatively large market, the sodium fluoride supplementation market. And these products are prescribed in areas that don't fluoridate the water supply in places like metropolitan New York, Long Island, metropolitan areas and rural areas of Pennsylvania and the Northeast, and in little spots all over the country. And then we have a first generation antihistamine, a very, very strong, very powerful antihistamine that's called Carbinol. And it's used for refractory severe allergies for kids that cannot get their allergies under control with OTC antihistamines. So that's about 2/3 of our revenue, those products that I just described. The other third is a line of consumer health products. And this is a really nice business. As I mentioned, we acquired a consumer health company back just prior to the pandemic. That company was called Innovis Pharmaceuticals. We now operate it as Aytu Consumer Health. And that's about a 35 growing to $40+ million revenue business. And that's a business that's managed very efficiently through online sales channels. We sell a combination of proprietary dietary supplements, all non-prescription, so all consumer-based health. And then we have a line of OTC medicines, and we have our own lines of products that compete with the likes of Rogaine, Flonase, Prilosec, and Nexium. And we're growing that line tremendously. We've recently signed an exclusive distribution agreement with a Jordanian company called Aman Pharma. And we now have access to a significant line of 20+ products in the eye, ear, and nasal category. So products that would compete with national brands, such as some of the Alcon or Allergan brands of eye drops, ear drops for things like swimmer's ear, nasal sprays for allergies, saline for allergies, and for nasal care, and so forth. It's a line of sterile products that are all non-prescription, and we have the exclusive U.S. rights to distribute all of their products into the U.S., and we're beginning to launch those now. So that's our business. On the RX side, we have a portfolio of 5 core products, as I described. We sell those through a nationwide sales force. They call on primarily pediatricians and psychiatrists and key prescribers of ADHD medicines. And the secret sauce for us is our sales force in combination with a program that we've designed that we call RX Connect. And it makes the ability to get branded prescriptions so much easier for patients. And the hassles that doctors face today, having to deal with PBMs and payers and the various hassles associated with writing brands, we cut all of that out. We sell directly to a network of roughly 1,000 pharmacies around the country. So our physician customers are able to prescribe to pharmacies that we know have our product stocked, that will take care to make sure the patients get the right product at the lowest copay possible. And they have exquisite service, white glove delivered to the patient's door as needed. And it really works well. And so that system has really fared well over the last several years. We adopted it from Neos that had implemented the system a couple of years prior to our acquisition. And so we're excited about how that program works, how it continues to expand, and how we can continue to put additional products onto that platform. So 2 core businesses, RX as well as consumer, generating roughly 100 million in revenue. Different go-to-market strategies, but both are very efficient and both are growing. So we're excited about the current state of the business.
So when you think about the state of the business and as we are right now, what do you think the biggest value drivers are?
For us, it's threefold and really a fourth component as well when I think about the pipeline. First and foremost, there's the big value in the fact that these are significant bases of revenue. When you look at our consumer business, it's almost a $40 million business. If you look at annualizing what it did last quarter, having posted just over 10 million in quarterly revenue for the March quarter. As I mentioned, the ADHD brands represent roughly half of our 100 million. So we've got a large base of revenue, and we think that's a significant statement around the value of the company and around the value of these products. And these products, as I alluded to, they're growing nicely, from both a volume perspective as well as from a revenue perspective. And so having a large base of revenue and then being able to achieve growth on top of that, we think can grow and drive significant value for the company. One other significant value driver for the company is following the acquisition of Neos back in March of last year, we made it clear that we would expect to gain significant efficiencies through synergies and various cost-saving measures. And we're doing that. And that's really a significant driver for the company. And we'll get later and really attempt to quantify how much we think we can get out of the synergies and how much more we have to do. But suffice it to say, we've gained significant leverage when you think about how we've consolidated the sales forces, when you think about how we've consolidated the C-suite. We've obviously cut out to significant administrative costs because there's a lot of overlap with two public companies, as Neos was. And so that's a big driver as we think about gaining additional efficiencies. One thing we made clear when we closed on the Neos acquisition is that we would shut down the manufacturing facility in Grand Prairie, Texas. And we'll talk a little bit further about that, but ultimately that stands to dramatically improve our P&L by virtue of dropping significant cash to the bottom line when we improve our gross profit margin. So those are big value drivers. And then the potential of our pipeline really can't be overstated. And we'll talk specifically about why I'm excited about the pipeline and specifically why we're excited about AR101, our rare disease asset. But as we begin to advance the pipeline, as we're doing now, I think folks will begin to see that there's real value for the future as the company advances these assets. And certainly it's science, so we have to make sure that we're clear to say this is a potential value driver. This is something that we think, if it hits, could be huge for patients and huge for the community that so desperately needs a treatment for this rare disease. And so we're excited about that. So to summarize, large base of growing revenue, an opportunity to gain efficiencies on top of the efficiencies we've already gained following our merger with Neos, and then the promise of our pipeline.
Great. And just to dig into that just a little bit more, in terms of the size of the cost savings and the scope, you alluded to the closing down Grand Prairie. Is that a difficult thing to do? And how do you obviously make up for the manufacturing you won't be doing?
Yeah, good question. So when we closed on the merger, we made it clear and put this in writing and have continued to talk through that we have quantifiable savings via synergies and otherwise of we think at least 15 million that we can squeeze out. And we've made a good deal of progress by virtue of consolidation of the commercial infrastructure. And so we're well on our way. And we are sort of halfway through the process of fully realizing the synergies associated with the Neos transaction. And so the big piece of it is the commercial consolidation, which is done, the G&A consolidation, which is underway, and that will continue to sort of unfold as we take this next big step of shutting down the Grand Prairie facility. Very difficult to do from an interpersonal perspective because obviously that's people's jobs and livelihoods, but we've been very straightforward with how we're approaching that. We've been very upfront with the timeline around it. And to answer your question, Roger, it's not a straightforward process, but we've got it well underway. And so what we've got going on is a tech transfer of the two lead ADHD brands, Adzenys and Cotempla, which are obviously the large value drivers for the company on the RX side. We've identified and have fully engaged with a contract manufacturer based here in the US and have the tech transfer process well underway. There's a process you have to go through. Of course, the first step is understanding that you've got bioequivalence, that you've got the same product manufactured there as you have currently manufactured here in Grand Prairie. And that process is now underway. So the first step is confirming that we do have a bioequivalent product, and we expect to make folks aware of kind of where we stand with respect to getting that bioequivalence data in and generated and affirming that in fact product A equals product B going forward. The next step would be to submit that data in the form of a PAS to the FDA and allow for them to review the data and then subsequently approve it if it meets their standards. So there's a couple of steps in the process. We're in the midst, as I said, of the bioequivalent study. Once, if and when we confirm that they are bioequivalent, we'll make that known and then submit the package to FDA, and then there's a process. And we've put out that we think sometime in the middle of next year, so calendar 23, is the right time to move and transition things fully over to this contract manufacturer. So we're still, call it 12 to 18 months away, 12 to 15 months away, probably realistically, of we hope having the FDA's approval to move the site. And at that point, we'll begin the process of, or continue the process of really shutting down, winding down the operation in Grand Prairie, Texas. Our lease goes well into 2024, and so we have time beyond the transfer of the manufacturing to make sure folks have the ability to find employment elsewhere, and we're helping with outplacement services and so forth. The net of that is we should see a dramatic improvement in gross profit because it's a relatively large facility that is significantly underutilized. We have to apply a lot of the amortization and the overhead, and some of those fixed and variable costs, and obviously directs and indirects get all thrown into the cost of goods. When you move the model to just a transfer price model where you're simply paying a fixed price per unit that you buy from a contract manufacturer, you do yourself a lot of good from a P&L perspective. And so it's going to have a dramatic improvement. And then there's real costs that you incur, of course. Of course, you have salaries, you have all the overhead. A lot of that gets baked into cost of goods sold, but there is a lot that does still just show up as raw expense, and then just cash needs when you're building inventory, when you're buying API, when you're buying raw materials and building that. So we stand to really save from both a improvement from an expense perspective, but also save from a real cash perspective. But that all should be underway in terms of really flipping the switch within, like I said, the next 12 to 15 months.
Right. And you guys are just at the end of your fiscal year. You're a June fiscal. So 12 months from now, assuming you get the FDA approvals, and as you move forward, how do you think about where your operating expenses will be? And given that you're doing close to 100 million in top line, kind of what should we think about from an operating bottom line standpoint?
We don't guide specifically to revenue, as you likely know, Roger, but we do expect to continue to grow from a top line perspective and grow units, and we also expect that we'll be able to improve both the net selling price, particularly on the RX side, and then of course improve the gross margin. From an OpEx perspective, we're going to stay where we are and probably get a little bit skinnier by virtue of getting some of these things consolidated. As I mentioned, a lot of what we're doing around Grand Prairie is really going to show up in the context of gross margin improvement, but there's also duplicative roles in several areas when you look at some of the G&A. So I do expect us to tick down from an OpEx perspective, such that with the change in gross profit margin and the significant change that will entail with some incremental growth, and it doesn't have to be monumental growth, but just solid, steady growth as we're demonstrating now on both the RX side as well as on the consumer side. In the not too distant future, we can envision that we'll be funding the commercial operation itself. So we'll have that if you viewed the commercial operation, and again, inclusive of the RX side as well as the consumer side, as a wholly owned separate entity. I think in the relative near term, in the next several quarters, and again, on the other side of the tech transfer and starting to manufacture through the CMO, I would fully expect that operates from an EBITDA positive perspective. So very excited about that. It's been a lot of work, but we're on track from what we originally said when we acquired Neos, that give us 18 months or so to sort of wring out all the duplicative expenses and get the tech transfer done. Give us an opportunity to integrate the sales force and continue to grow. And we'll get there from an EBITDA perspective. And what's important is we're growing in the face of a global pandemic that still hasn't entirely abated, and a sales force that from a pro forma perspective is about half the size of what it was 2 years ago. If you look at the Neos sales force, a year before the pandemic struck, they were about 125 person sales force. They then skinnied down to about 75. The entire ADHD, what we call CNS sales force, is now only 40 people. The Aytu heritage team was upwards of 35 representatives. That now is down to 9. And so we're doing more revenue, driving more prescriptions with a much smaller footprint. And that, coupled with the skinnying down of the operational piece, and again, Grand Prairie is really the centerpiece of that. I think there's a realistic likelihood that in the relative near term, folks are going to see EBITDA positive when you look at just the core operations and the ability for the commercial ops to fund itself.
That's phenomenal. Let me kind of pull us along a little bit. Josh, you already mentioned the pipeline and the VEDS asset. Could you go into a little more detail and talk about what exactly you're working on and where it's going?
Yeah, happy to. This is an exciting proposition for the company, Roger, as we think about the future and how we really build big value and create a value for patients in this huge area of unmet need. So first of all, let me talk a little bit about the disease, which is called VEDS. It stands for vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. Vascular Ehlers-Danlos syndrome is the most severe subtype of a constellation of syndromes called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which are a grouping of connective tissue disorders. And VEDS is the vascular type, as I mentioned, and it's the most severe. It's deadly. Patients, on average, first of all, they inherit a mutation of a specific gene that encodes what is called type 3 collagen. Type 3 collagen is chiefly responsible for forming the strength of the vasculature, so essentially our arteries and our hollow organs. And because of this mutation, patients have very fragile, very weakened vasculatures, and they're very prone to spontaneous ruptures throughout the arterial tree. And what happens, unfortunately, inevitably, is these patients have catastrophic blowouts. They have an aortic rupture, for example, bleed out and die. On average, these patients don't see their 51st birthday. 50% of patients die by the 51st birthday. Most patients have had a major complication by the time they're in their 40s. And there are no treatments anywhere on the planet for VEDS. So this is a huge unmet need. And what we have is an asset that we call AR101, which is a repurposed molecule that was originally developed by Eli Lilly for cancer. And that molecule is called enzastaurin. Enzastaurin is a PKC beta inhibitor. PKC stands for protein kinase C, and this is specifically the beta isoform. What we now know, and so let me take a step back and say Eli Lilly originally developed this asset for cancer, specifically for brain cancer and for a type of lymphoma, and it failed in phase 3. And so they shelved the asset, as is often the case. Unfortunately, those are very difficult cancers to treat, and they followed suit and simply did not patients did not remain in remission, and so they shelved the asset. In the intervening period, a very prominent geneticist, professor, researcher at Johns Hopkins by the name of Hal Dietz discovered that PKC inhibition may very well arrest VEDS. By that, I mean, it may enable the PKC levels in these patients with VEDS to come way down. What we know about VEDS now is something that was never known heretofore, which is the fact that it's not just a disease that's associated with sort of weakened, brittle vasculature. It's a disease that is associated with and is largely caused by significant upregulation of PKC. And so we have a PKC inhibitor now with enzastaurin that can squelch the signal and can return, in animal models, the survival curves to normal. So how we know and what we think is happening with disease now, and what is really getting better understood all the time, and again, this is all led by Dr. Hal Dietz in his lab, is that when you knock in the mutation, the COL3A1 mutation into these mice, they die of aortic ruptures almost immediately. They have catastrophic events. They have the blowouts, just as you see in the human condition, and unfortunately, they die. When you take those same animals that have had that mutation knocked in and treat them with enzastaurin, the survival curves return to almost normal, 60 to 90% reductions in events. These animals, in some cases, go on to live their entire lives normally, as if they had no mutation. So what we've learned is nature has found a way to arrest and treat this condition by virtue of squelching the signal, this aberrant cell signal that's caused by this dysregulation of PKC. And that's very exciting. So exciting such that we took it to the FDA, and we took the Lilly data with all the cancer information, and that's reams and reams of data, all the preclinical, all the tox, all of the safety data, all of the human data that's been compiled over a decade plus of research in cancer. We married that with the animal data. And by the way, if you look at patients with VEDS that died of the condition, and if you look at their aortas, ex vivo, after they've died, you see that they have tremendously pronounced levels of PKC. And so 1+1 may very well equal 2. You've got animals that when you squelch PKC, they live normal lives, even in the face of having the genetic mutation and the weakened vasculature. You take the fact that we know that these patients that died have extremely high levels of PKC. You go to the FDA and they say, go ahead and progress directly to clinical studies. In fact, we're directly progressing to a pivotal study. And the FDA has authorized us to do that. The EMA in Europe has as well. And so we've got a single study set to get underway to prove out once and for all that this may in fact be the solution to solving the VEDS problem, which is tamping down, squelching, if you will, PKC in these patients to enable them to have fewer events, and in some cases, maybe no events at all, such that they can live normal lives.
And just in terms of this, how many people in the United States, let alone the world, suffer from VEDS? And from a product standpoint, what's the opportunity for the company?
It's a huge opportunity for a couple of reasons, and one of which is there are no treatments anywhere in the world. The prevalence is in the neighborhood of 1 in 50,000 people. It affects males and females equally. So in the US, if you run the math, that is something in the neighborhood of 6,000 to 7,000 patients at least, and maybe more. We know there are 6,000 to 7,000 identified based on database searches and based on what we know just in interacting with the sites that treat these patients. There's an equal number, as you would expect, in the major markets in Europe. And so what we've identified in just the EU5 countries, the US, and in Japan, that is a population of VEDS patients identified, knowing they have VEDS in the neighborhood of 16,000 patients. That doesn't take into consideration the smaller European countries, Southeast Asia, or any of the other countries around the world. This is an orphan disease. We already have orphan drug designation in the US, in the EU, so orphan drug pricing would be the expectation here. And so if you just do the math of 16,000 patients at something that approximates a relatively rare disease and orphan and priced as such, and assume just 50% penetration of just the known patients, you get to a very large number from a commercial opportunity. And again, there's no treatment anywhere in the world for this. So these patients are going to be lining up. The advocacy groups are absolutely clamoring for us to get the study started. So we're excited about the opportunity to give these patients hope where currently, frankly, there is none.
Wow. And obviously, to get a regulatory approval for something like this costs money. Could you discuss how you think about Aytu's capital needs and potential sources over the next couple of years?
Yeah, happy to. So we ended March 31 with about 27 million in the bank. And so, solidly positioned here in the relative near term. And what I always like to point out to prospective investors and current investors is that we have optionality. We've got a combination and potentially really a unique setup in terms of how we can potentially access additional capital. First of all, we do have a senior loan, so we've accessed capital from a non-dilutive perspective. We have a senior loan of $15 million, which isn't too much. I mean, that's enough for us to pay. That's an interest-only loan and the ability to extend the interest-only period out. We also have a working capital revolver, which has been helpful for us. And then we can consider various options, to fund the company as we need to going forward. First of all, and as I mentioned earlier, we're not far from being able to cash flow the core commercial operations. And so that's exciting to be relatively close from that perspective. And then we would consider non-dilutive sources of subordinated debt, some potentially convertible structures, but we'd also consider monetizing assets if the opportunity presented itself, and that could be a source of non-dilutive capital. And then, of course, we do have access to the equity markets as a public company. We do have an ATM in place and could tap that as needed, and could tap into the equity markets along the way as we need. But optionality has been really a watchword for us because of the number of assets we have, because of the fact that we are generating significant revenue. We're approaching break even and cash flowing on the commercial ops. So we feel good about how we're positioned.
That's great. In terms of how you look to the future, what excites you most about what's going on in the company, and what do you think is going to be there to drive additional value?
I think three things that really excite me about the near term and company's future: the growth potential. We compete in these large markets in ADHD and in consumer health and in pediatrics in general. and the ability to continue to grow these products in these large markets. The ability to start self-funding the commercial operations is exciting to me. I think we are right there at the precipice, and with these changes we're talking about and this improvement in gross margin and gaining efficiencies, we're going to be right there. And the pipeline, I can't overstate the excitement we have for AR101 and the ability for that to really drive value for the company going forward and help these patients that currently have no treatment options anywhere in the world.
Very good. Is there anything else that you think might be helpful for investors to understand about the business?
It's really just, I think one final thought is that we've done a lot of great work over the last couple of years to get where we are. We're at the turning point in the context of, approaching EBITDA positive on the commercial operations, and the fact that we have a really first of its kind only treatment option or only potential treatment option for vets is extremely exciting. So we appreciate you, appreciate folks taking a look at the company as we're at this important stage.
Wow. Josh, again, thank you very much for your time today, and thank you for telling us about what's going on at Aytu. We greatly appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for your time, Roger.
You're very welcome. To anybody out there who's not already signed up for a one-on-one, again, please send me an email at weiss@lythampartners.com, or again, visit us at www.lythampartners.com/virtual and click the one-on-one meeting request button. We hope you enjoy the conference. Thank you very much.